CGO. So, good afternoon. We're going to talk about the financial incapacities linked to the CGO project. And we're going to ask the question about whether France can afford the CGO project financially and what it will cost. So my name is Marie Frachist. I am a lawyer for the NGO Sortir du Nucléaire, which is a federation of associations which fights against nuclear power. And Samuel Delalande will also speak. He is a lawyer in Rennes in France. We work together on the question of the costs of the CGO project, and we have referred this to the Council of State, this project problem, and that's why what we've been doing. So I'd like to start about talking about what CGO is. I'd like to do it quickly. And then I'd like to say how that fits in with the Euratom directive. The CGO project is a huge project, which is way bigger than any other comparable industrial project. The French Radioactive Waste Agency wants to build this facility 500 meters under the ground, with a lot of other things above ground, ventilation facilities and so forth. The cost of all of this are all right off the map, tens of billions of euros, and the information that we have available is scarce and difficult to get at. Concerning Chapter 3 of the Euratom Treaty, the Euratom Directive establishes a framework for the management of radioactive waste and spent fuel. The French law on this, which CGO is subject to, all needs to operate within the Euratom framework, which is a minimal framework that needs to be respected. So we will look at the regulatory framework for the cost of the CGO project firstly, and then after that we will talk about the financing, the specific financing of the project, and my colleague Mr. Delalande will speak about that. Concerning the regulatory framework, we will first of all look at European law, in particular 2 articles of the Euratom directive, Articles 11 and 9. In Article 11 of the directive, I won't read the whole thing out to you, it's on the screen here, but each member state is responsible for the implementation of its national program for the management of nuclear waste and spent fuel, and that involves all steps of this from the production to the storage. And then it says that each member state needs to update regularly its national program. Article 9 of the directive says that looks at financial resources, and it says that member states need to ensure that the national authorities make sufficient funds available for the implementation of the national plans which I've just spoken about, thinking in particular of nuclear waste and spent fuel, bearing in mind the responsibilities of the producers of this waste and this spent fuel. So this article, Article 9, takes up one of the objectives of the Euratom Directive, namely that member states need to make sufficient funds available to deal with radioactive waste and spent fuel. The aim of this is to avoid imposing on future generations problems due to this radioactive waste. And so the member states must put in place a national framework which has sufficient funds attached to it to implement the national plan in question. The French law obliges nuclear power producers of waste to make money available, but there's nothing about it being sufficient funds being made available, just funds. So the procedure that needs to be followed to get a CGO, the authorization for CGO, can be seen in the program law on sustainable management of radioactive waste, which sets out the provisions for deep geological repositories. And several estimates have been made of the cost of all of this. Now, normally it's up to the ANRA, the Radioactive Waste Agency, to follow through on all of this, but it also involves for Areva, ENGIE, and others to make sufficient funds available to finance the project on an ongoing basis. The cost of the CGO project, defining the amounts that ENGIE and the other companies need to make available, has direct impact on the financial health of these companies. Article L of the Code of the Environment says that the operators of nuclear facilities need to make money available to meet the costs of ongoing management of the waste and transport of the waste. And the next article, 542, says that in a nuclear facility, the money needs to be made available as defined in the previous article. And another article of the law on the environment states that the French Radioactive Waste Agency needs to do an evaluation of the costs necessary for the management of medium and high level radioactive waste, including the tax costs. And the minister then decides how much money this all amounts to, and none of this guarantees that the amount that will be required to be set aside will be sufficient for the project.
Le ministre
The minister responsible for energy has absolutely no obligation to have a minimum figure required. And if there is no further procedure, the Minister of Energy, who at the time was Ségolène Royal, determined a figure which was not sufficient. And so, on the 15th of January 2016, a circular established 25 million euros, the necessary amount of money to be put aside for high and medium level waste, such as will be stored at CGO. And as we see, there is no evaluation that has been made public to justify this sum. So I'll now give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Delalande. Good afternoon, everybody. I am a lawyer in Rennes, that's true, and I will continue the presentation on the CGO project. We are faced with a real smoke and mirrors game. The producers of waste don't want to set money aside because that won't be any good. It won't do them any good on the share market where they are listed. To add to what Mr. Didier said, you need to realize that the determination of the money to be set aside by the producers of nuclear waste depends on an operation that is based on the evaluation of that cost, which will be calculated with the actualization calculations. So this mathematical calculation is very much like the compound interest rates, such as one sees on mortgages. And it's on the basis of this calculation that provisions can be decided, will be decided, as to the amount that is to be set aside for nuclear waste management. And the figures are colossal, tens of billions of euros. The Court of Auditors did a calculation that came to this figure of tens of billions of euros. If we go back in the slides, previous slide, behind, keep going, back. Okay, this is the one. So there in 2005, a quick calculation on the back of a serviette, so to speak, was done where the Radioactive Waste Agency wanted to look about how much CGO would cost. And the initial estimate was 13.5 to 16.5 billion euros. And then the DGEC, which is part of the Ministry of Energy in France, came up with a new estimate in 2009, which came to 33.8 and 35.9 billion euros. So we have two estimates here. And then in 2013, the Radioactive Waste Agency presented only the 2005 figure, 13.5 to 16.5. It disregarded the later calculation of the ministry, done by the DGEC for the ministry. So there is a problem of communication of the data available. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So we have a government agency and the ministry didn't communicate. So there was no debate about the two different calculations, certainly not in public. In 2014, there was a second report of the Court of Auditors when the debate was being tentatively put on the table. And then 2014, the Court of Auditors decided to have come up with another estimate. And they included research and insurance and taxation and came up with the figure of 41.2 billion euros. So this cost is to be determined by the Minister for the Environment with, as Mr. Didier said, in the situation in which the producers didn't want to pay, 19 billion euros was their estimate. It's a 3-page calculation. In fact, no, it's a 10-page calculation. It's rather ridiculous. They said the project will last 140 years. And so there's not a lot of detail. It's just 10 pages. And the ANDRA looked at the question a little bit more closely, and they came up with a figure of 34.5 billion euros, including R&D up to 2024. And a range of variables, which they also factored in. So the nuclear agency, it felt that this was an optimistic assessment based on a certain number of points, but I won't go into the detail of those. If you go to the next slide. So there it is. So in 2014, we had these estimates, but the NGOs and associations couldn't had their hands on them at all. It was impossible. We knew that these calculations were being done, but we had no access to them. We put in requests for these documents to get the information. And we had to go through a whole lot of bureaucratic hurdles just to get the information. And then following that, there was a public dissemination of the figures. The ministry said, look, we're transparent, and they published the reports, but we had to struggle like crazy to get them. But then they published them in January 2016. And then on the 15th of January, there was panic. The ministry came up with the figure of the cost for CGO of 25 billion euros, which they just pulled out of a hat. Absolutely out of a hat. They didn't turn to the auditors, they didn't turn to the Radioactive Waste Agency's calculation or anybody else. They just pulled the figure out of a hat. So we then went to the Council of State with this, because we don't have an environmental court in France. It would be wonderful. That would be a dream for us. But no, we don't have such a court, and we have to go to the Council of State, as it's called, because we don't have a court to go to. And so what we do is we said that the objective estimate for CGO is not in keeping with Articles 9 and 11 of the Euratom Directive. In that, it doesn't allow, it's not sufficient resources to manage the waste in keeping with the national plan. There's just not enough money for that. They say it's the CGO cost. It has nothing to do with the national program. I said there's no problem. So our referral was rejected. We said 25 billion euros. That figure was just invented. And they say, no, the minister decides. You can go home. Just go home. And so, no, we didn't win that battle, and that was no surprise to us, quite frankly. The audit office produced another report. They had always produced reports. That's what it's there for. And so in 2019, another report called, as it did in 2014, called for a realistic evaluation and also to include MOX and retreated uranium in the National Management Plan. So they had to, we called on them to add additional forms of radioactive waste to the calculations. And so the Court of Auditors said that would increase the cost by 5 billion. And the next slide, please. Yep. So the calculations for CGO were under-evaluated, and I won't re-explain what Mr. Didier said, but more the actualization calculation is high, more the money set aside is low. And it's extremely difficult to find the actualization rate. Sometimes it's coded in this way, in other ways it's coded in another way. I mean, it's all very opaque. Nothing is transparent at all. It's impossible to get firm figures in relation to the actualization cost from year to year. But 4.1% and 3.9%, that's a bit like interest rates. And it's extremely high. And more it's high, more the money set aside, the provisions are low. As Mr. Didier said, you can see it on the Court of Auditors table. A change of 0.2% over the whole calculation makes a difference of 1.5 billion euros. It's huge. If you go from 4.1% to 1%, all the calculations are completely blown out of the water. EDF will go broke. And then you'll have problems with a company that's too big to fail, failing. I mean, and so, focusing on CGO, what questions does all of this raise? Next slide, please. So, if you don't have sufficient resources from the producers of radioactive waste, then you have a problem. Because the project can be stopped halfway before being brought to fruition. A colleague with whom I worked on all of these questions, he determined that a large part of the cost for CGO was to do with the pilot phase of the project. So the money that was left would be very little for the real activities. So you just have the pilot project and then no resources to carry on after the pilot project. So as this is what Mr. Tuillier referred to, a situation he referred to, and this is like this is what we call this is a standard situation in which people just pick a figure, multiply it by 3 or 4 by a certain number of years. Who pays? No one knows. The producers of the waste won't be doing it, in my opinion. And so all of this poses a huge problem. And this sort of problem exists with current nuclear facilities. It's the costs problems which are pushing us to stop nuclear production. Beyond that, and this is a big question, EDF says that it has 37 billion money in provisions, but we don't know what that money is for. We cannot see it all. If it's real money, if it's actually available money, if it will be available in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we have absolutely no guarantee about this money and what it can be used for. So these are comments of the Court of Auditors. Here the Court of Auditors comes back to what it called for in 2012. It just repeats it. So what about the role of the European Commission and as policeman of the treaties, of the directive? Beyond checking whether the member states are applying the national plan or not, what can the Commission do specifically about these financial questions? Has the European Court of Auditors, does it only look at the use of the funds of the European institutions? Could it go beyond that? Because their expertise could be used to see whether the provisions, the money that's being set aside for the future, is sufficient and whether it can be used as it is meant to be used. Thank you.
Monsieur Gariba,
thank you. Garriga is preparing his replies. Can the Commission play policeman on these reserves? Or is it national sovereignty? However big the lies may be. Thank you, Mrs. Rivasi. The European Court of Auditors is an independent institution with a role defined in the treaties, as you know. I don't think that you can follow the proposal made here. But it's up to the Court of Auditors to reply, and not me. What a shame, says the audience.
On pourrait saisir la Cour des comptes européenne.
You can go to the Court of Auditors. We have a European directive which says that the countries must put aside reserves. If you could show that there aren't any reserves, even for the pilot project 2020, it should be the pilot project for CGO, which is between 6 and 7 billions. There should be reserves for that. But afterwards, we need your expertise, and then we can go to the Court of Auditors to see if that's in line. The French Court of Auditors makes recommendations. It's like the IAEA, little recommendations.
The implementation of directives is not controlled by the European Court of Auditors. The implementation of directives is controlled by the Commission. So if the Commission finds ground for infringing on the Articles 9 and 11, the Commission will. And the Articles 9 and 11 are a little bit complicated in the way that they've been explained here, and they are not particularly strong and resistant to a number of legal cases. So we are looking at this very carefully, and as I said, we have 32 infringements open. So we will have to see how and when we can legally pursue these kind of cases. So don't think that this is not being looked at. It is being looked in the general framework of the transposition of this directive. So let's not invent other actors that have competencies or not in this game. Yeah?